Hey Warriors, this is Estephany, Director of Academic Support here on campus. And we're so excited to have you guys join us on this roundtable. The way we were able to kind of host this was we were approved a grant from the CCCU. And as a result, we're able to actually host a roundtable about immigration. So we're really stoked to be able to talk about that with you guys, with Dr. Tisha Rajendra and Dr. Glenn Butner. And so let me just kind of dive into the roles real quick. Dr. Glenn Butner is our Associate Professor of Theology and Ministry here on campus. And Dr. Tisha Rajendra is the Associate Professor of Ethics at Loyola University. And she's written a book on migrants and citizens, which actually our library will have hopefully on campus. So if you want to be able to read that, you'll be able to access that in our library. And so again, we're really excited to be able to talk about the importance of immigration in our country and how to proceed forward. So, all right, let's start with kind of like a bird's eye view of immigration. And so Dr. Rajendra, what are some ways that Americans most typically think about immigrants and immigration?
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, Estephany, and thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so honored to be here with all of you today. So I think Americans, when we talk about immigration, there's a lot of emphasis on the free choice of immigrants. Well, they chose to come here. And there's like an implicit and so what? They chose to come here and so they could always go back. If they don't like it here, if they don't like their wages, if they don't like their treatment, if they don't like it here, they can always go back. And that is sort of the dominant narrative. They choose to come, it's a free choice, and therefore there's like, we don't have much responsibility to them, because if they don't like it, they can go back. Also, another assumption is that immigrants are very, very poor, that they come here to maximize their economic well-being. So if you are poor in one country, but middle class or wealthy in another, of course, you'll want to come. And then there's a third assumption that the harder we make it for immigrants to come here or to be here, the less likely they are to stay. And so I think those are some of the ways that Americans typically think about immigration.
That's really good. I know a lot of your research has focused on trying to like better the narrative for immigration. So would you like to kind of share a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, so first of all, that overall idea that it's a free choice is somewhat true. There is choice in immigration, but I'm not sure I would say free choice. I would say that there's a larger context of choice. The first context is the context of family. So in a lot of places, in especially the developing world, families will often send one member to the US or to Europe in order to provide financial security that is not available through the institutions in their own country. So for example, in this country, there's credit insurance and crop insurance for farmers. So if your crop completely fails, a farmer is not left, I mean, there's a lot of poverty in farming, and I don't want to pretend that there aren't poor farmers in this country, but there are institutional supports for farmers through our government. In a lot of developing countries, there is no crop insurance. There is no access to credit. So if your crop fails, but you have a family member working in the US or working in Canada or working in Europe, there's a buffer. So a lot of immigrants are not like, oh, I just want to maximize my own economic well-being, I'll go somewhere else. They're really trying to take care of their families, and it's an enormous sacrifice for them. I don't think any of us would willingly move far away from our families if we could choose to live closer to them and to visit whenever we wanted. The second larger context is labor markets. So basically, we have what's called a secondary labor market for agricultural workers. In other words, these jobs have always been dangerous, they've always been underpaid, and they've always been really hard work. And in the past, women and teenagers used to do those jobs because they were parts of families, right? So you didn't have to pay them. And then in the South, at least, after the end of slavery, African Americans did those jobs. And today, in many cases, immigrants do jobs in agriculture and construction. So the fact that we even have this secondary labor market, and we always have, means it doesn't go away depending on our immigration policy. And there were stories within the last 4 years of like crops rotting in the field because farmers just couldn't pay enough, because migrants weren't coming because of the harsher border policies. And farmers just couldn't pay enough to have people working their fields. Food just doesn't cost that much. So there is a labor market demand for migrant workers that the US is responsible for. So yes, it is the choice of migrants, but it's also our choice. And sometimes we focus on the choice of migrants to come here without focusing on our own role, our own choices in creating demand for migrant workers. And then the third context is what I'll call the history of migration flows, which is that migrants don't just up and decide to go to a new country just because it's there. There's almost always some kind of initiation of a migration flow that's usually the responsibility of the destination country. So, for example, Mexicans have been migrating to the United States since the 19th century. There are no new waves of Mexican migration. This is one wave that started over 100 years ago, when there were railroads into Mexico, and companies would go and send their recruiters deep into the Mexican countryside to recruit labor for Mexican laborers in cities like Chicago and Detroit. So, and then once you start a labor flow, you can't turn it off very easily. It just has to kind of run its course. There are also colonial labor flows, like from France to Algeria, or from South Asia to England. So again, it's not just about the choice of migrants, it's also about the past of the destination countries. So yes, whenever there's a migration, someone has made a choice, whether it's an individual or a family. But those choices take place in larger contexts where there's not only the responsibility and the choice of the migrants, but also the responsibilities and the choices of people in destination countries like the United States.
Oh, I love that. I love that you just shared that. So actually, like even personally, I'm from Honduras. I was born in Honduras, and a hurricane hit our country, which caused my mother to bring us over to the US.
Yeah.
And the opportunities that she found were very scarce, even scarce as far as being able to, finally become citizens, which we did this past summer. But it took us a while. I mean, I came here when I was a year and 8 months, and I'm now 23, and it took me that long. It took our family that long to finally feel like we belonged in the US. And so to realize that, one, yes, that wave will continue to keep occurring, and two, that the fact that our country is not more prepared for things that they, should anticipate happening, is definitely something to talk about. So, and understanding the narratives that happen with, migration, what do you think our moral responsibilities towards immigrants should be?
Oh, could I just say one thing about Honduras, please?
Yes.
Okay, so so this was Hurricane Mitch, right?
Yes, correct.
Okay, so a lot of garment factories had relocated to Honduras. Garment factories, what are they making? They're making clothes. Clothes for where? Well, for us, right? For our textile market. And so when the hurricane hit, a lot of those companies like instantaneously went out of business, and the work in the garment factories was not It was more money than people would make otherwise, but women especially would age out really quickly. Like how many years or decades can you spend working like in an airless factory hunched over a sewing machine?
Yeah.
So once women became older and slower, or their eyes started to go, right? I mean, and that's young, right? Like if you need reading glasses, you can go to CVS and buy a pair for a few dollars. But if you're from a poor family in Honduras and you need like glasses, I guess the people watching this don't yet need glasses, but your parents probably need reading glasses to read. I should have reading glasses to read. You can't sew without reading glasses. So when women got into their like 30s, early 40s, they'd just be fired from the garment factory. So a lot of those women went to the US. And once the hurricane came through, it overnight wiped out the garment factory industry in Honduras. So then there was a migration, but again, it wasn't like, oh, what should I do? I know, I'll go to the US. It was because there was already a migration flow that was activated by the disruption of the traditional labor market in Honduras and activated this transnational labor flow, which had its origins in the garment factories in Honduras. And those had it's a longer history, but that also had its origins in the US military interventions in Honduras. There was like a US military base. So we're not talking about like, oh, let's just go to the US. I don't know what else to do. It's like they were working for US companies. And once one person leaves, many people will leave. Yes, out of desperation, but let's not pretend that like Honduras was like this country that the US had nothing to do with. There was all this history between the US and Honduras.
That's so good. Yeah, understanding the perceptions that come with, I think what Americans have when it comes to immigration and the reasons why people come here. I think understanding that history is so vital to being able to kind of even have a heart to like, oh, this is one of the reasons why people do these things. And so I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, I've learned something today now, so thanks for sharing. So yeah, what is our moral responsibility towards immigrants?
So I think to understand the responsibility, you have to know the whole story, and it's a pretty complex and multifaceted story, like I just said about like, the US military base in Honduras, and the garment factory in Honduras, and then the labor market in the US for specifically Central Americans in like the 90s and early 2000s. Factory workers, domestics, we don't want to pay living wages for those jobs. And so they don't, like, that's what creates the labor demand that people respond to when they're desperate and they can't have, and there's unemployment is high in their own context. So I think the first responsibility is to know the story, know why migrants are here, know where they're from, know, Honduras is different than Cuba. It's, yes, they're both Spanish speaking countries, but, different histories, different peoples, different contexts. Know the story of Honduras. If you know someone from Honduras, ask them if they want to talk about it. Know how it's different from El Salvador, or it's different from Mexico, or it's different from Cuba, or which is different from, the Dominican Republic. So know the stories, know the histories, and know the stories of the immigrants you interact with. And then once you know the story, I think seek justice, like seek to treat people justly. And this is hard to do on an individual level sometimes, because, you might have a gardener who's an immigrant who you're underpaying, or who your parents are underpaying, or you might not. So and if you don't have any immigrants or migrants in your circle who you are depending on to treat justly, that comes to policies, like advocate for more just policies, for more generous asylum policies, for human rights for immigrants, for anti-deportation policies, because I don't think you can say, well, they shouldn't be here if there's all this stuff that the US as a country has done spanning back decades that are in part the reasons why immigrants are here. So that's what I would say about moral responsibilities to immigrants. Know the stories, the whole stories, and then seek justice.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much. I'm just going to reiterate that. Know the narrative, know the story, seek justice. Thank you so much for sharing that. So Dr. Butner, I know you've recently started writing on some immigration as well. What narrative have you found to help us rethink refugee resettlement?
The narrative I've been writing on, it's not necessarily a new one. It's from Matthew 2, looking at Jesus and Mary and Joseph having to flee to Egypt because of the threat on their lives from Herod. And it's something that, I have a sermon from Martin Luther, 500 years ago, that he thought some about refugees in that context. After World War I, there's a great magazine that was comparing Belgian refugees to the Holy Family fleeing. So in some sense, there's nothing really new there to take that story and apply it to our issues of refugee rights and refugee law today. But what I haven't seen in my research, and Dr. Rajendra has read more than me and could correct me here maybe later on, but I'm unaware of anybody that's taken this and has analyzed what would actually happen if Mary and Joseph tried to apply for asylum or tried to go through our modern refugee system. If we did this sort of thought experiment of what if we had the same sorts of laws present back in the first century under those historical circumstances. And I think walking through that narrative, it challenges both the policies we have in place and some of our ethical commitments, but it also illustrates some of the principles that we've already heard about in this roundtable.
That's so good. I love how biblical that is. I mean, it's a mandate. It's a biblical mandate that we have. So how have you found this narrative to help us understand our responsibilities towards refugees?
Sure. There's a lot. I think for our purposes, I'd probably talk about three main points. One of them would be the idea of solidarity. So the idea of needing to feel some sort of connection with someone who is a refugee and needing to act accordingly. So Jesus actually in Matthew 25 tells the parable of the sheep and the goats. And it's a parable about sorting sort of at the final judgment, those who receive a reward and those who don't, those who kind of have a punishment for failing to do what they should. And for each group, Jesus goes through a group of individuals in need and includes among them the phrase, I was a stranger and you invited me in. And then he tells those who invited the stranger in that whatever they've done to the least of these, they've done to him. Because the individuals say, well, when did we invite you in? I never saw you. So Jesus is saying, if you care for somebody who is a foreigner, who is a migrant, who maybe is a refugee, then it's as if you're caring for Christ. And I don't think that's fully arbitrary, given a lot of the categories he lists, because those are things that he was during the state in his life. So his family had to flee to Egypt. So I think that challenges us. But at the same time, we can kind of lapse into this sort of rescue narrative. Oh, poor asylum seekers, poor refugees, we need to save them. And that's not quite right either, because if we look at Jesus, obviously he's our savior. He has agency, he has abilities and powers. And so while we are called to care for people like him, it could be that refugees like him actually are the ones that are going to make a bigger impact on our culture than we might. And so I think he gives us some perspective on the idea of solidarity there. Second, I think this narrative does illustrate some of the patterns that we've already heard from Dr. Rajendra. For example, we could ask the question, why did they run away to Egypt? And of course, Matthew 2 tells us that an angel says, go to Egypt. So we could just sit back and say, well, case closed. You do what an angel says. But it actually makes a lot of sense from a human standpoint, why they might escape to Egypt. And so we can imagine maybe this is part of why God chose Egypt as their sort of destination point. We have centuries of history between the people of Israel and Egypt, and in many times of need, the people of Israel went to Egypt in order to find safety and protection. So sort of in the national consciousness of Mary and Joseph, they'd be able to imagine going there. But also because of some more recent political events I won't really get into, but recent to the first century, there was a very vibrant Jewish community in a number of major cities in Egypt, like Alexandria. So if you're a refugee and you're trying to flee somewhere, it's much safer to go somewhere where you have someone who speaks your language, who might help you with some support when you first get there. And so we can understand why they might have gone to Egypt. But the third thing, I think, is if we imagine, would the Holy Family, when they went to Egypt, have gotten any international support if our current refugee system was in place? The answer would probably be no. So our modern system is largely based on a UN protocol from 1951, which was expanded in 67. And then US law in 1980, we have most of our current refugee laws in place. And there are a number of reasons why under these laws, a family like Jesus's probably wouldn't be protected. First, we tend to only care for people who've gotten outside of their nation's borders. Internally displaced persons, or IDPs, people whose life is seriously at risk, like Jesus's family's was, but they can't get outside of their borders. Current international law doesn't really afford them any special rights and any special protections. But we've already seen, why is it that Jesus, Mary, and Joseph went to Egypt? Well, probably because that's the trip they could reasonably make. And so the political system was a little different in the first century. We might say that they made it outside of their nation's borders because they were beyond Herod, or we might say that they were still in the Roman Empire, so they weren't outside of their borders. And if we say they were still in the empire, they wouldn't really have any claim to foreign help or foreign protection. But let's imagine that we count them as having left their borders. And even then, probably we could say that, Christ wouldn't be protected. Either he could seek asylum, so once he arrived in Egypt, he then requests political protection from the nation there, in which case that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to get it. We know from the Bible that he's facing a legitimate threat, but the burden of proof in courts is pretty high. And if you have holes in your story or two different versions of your story, you're likely to be rejected. And of course, that's kind of what we have in Jesus's story. The Matthew story and the Luke story aren't quite the same. Luke doesn't even mention this. And some Bible scholars have doubted whether, the flight to Egypt even happened in Matthew. They say Matthew has an ulterior motive here. He's got a theological agenda and none of it's real. So there's reason to think that, he probably wouldn't have been granted asylum, which means he wouldn't have been protected and probably would have been deported back to his homeland, where he might have been caught and killed. Even if he didn't fall, to problems of not having enough evidence, asylum has been pretty inconsistent. So in our country in 1984, for example, 100% of all Cuban asylum seekers were given asylum status, asylee status, and around 3% of Guatemalans and Salvadorians were. Just because Americans were more concerned about Cubans because they saw them as part of the fight against communism. So ideology plays a big role there. So they probably wouldn't have gotten asylum, which means they wouldn't have had protection. One more route here that I'm only going to briefly mention is they could have just wound up in a refugee camp. And unfortunately, only about 2% of refugees are found a new place to settle. The rest of them just stay in the camp for decades. Their average time there is about 17 years. So kind of walking through the system, we see that the patterns that Jesus's family took really fits what we see in migrants today. We see biblical reason why we should want to care for Christ and people like him today. But then we see a system that likely wouldn't provide protection for Jesus or his family. And I think this causes us to say, well, there's something broken in our system and it needs reform. That's kind of my analysis in a nutshell.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. Wow, that just blew my mind too. I'm like, oh my goodness, yeah, if Jesus was alive today, holy cow. So thank you for that. Dr. Rajendra, actually, I know you've done some work in solidarity. How is this concept helpful and how might it be limited in thinking about immigration?
had to unmute myself. In my book, I define justice. I said, know the story and then seek justice. In my book, I define justice as responsibility to relationships. So, let's say you have a babysitter, and the babysitter comes and looks after your kids, and many of you might have babysat. And let's say, you come back and the parents come back and they're like, oops, I don't know where my checkbook is. I'll get you the check soon. And so they drive you home, and then a month later, you're like, hello, you never paid me. And they're like, oh, right, we'll put the check in the mail. And a week goes by and you're like, I never received that check. And they're like, I put it in the mail. Okay, so this is like a very everyday thing that might have happened to you, but you can see how this is not responsibility to a relationship. They trusted you with their child and you took care of their child, and they can't pay you on time. Meanwhile, you don't have a salary. You have books to buy for school. You have tuition payments to make. You have your rent to pay maybe. And so you are dependent on timely payment for this babysitting, and they can't be bothered to pay you. That's injustice. So justice is responsibility to the relationship. Between babysitters and parents, it looks one way: regular, on-time payment. Between parents and children, it might look another way. I have responsibilities to my children that I don't have to other people's children. It's not that other people's children are less important or less in the image of God than my children. It's just that they're my children. I'm responsible for feeding them and providing for them and educating them. And I argue in my book that depending on the country, responsibility to immigrants might be the same as responsibility to citizens. If we've done something to destabilize or disrupt labor markets in a country, then we have very strong responsibilities there. So that's what justice is: responsibility to a relationship. Solidarity, I think, is the first step towards justice. I think justice is a very high bar. I mean, it's not between babysitters and parents, maybe, but between migrants and citizens in some of these countries where there's this long, complex, layered history of relationship, we might be a long way from justice. But solidarity is the first steps, and it's the steps that you can take as individuals. You might not have power to change migration policy or asylum policy at a national level, but there are things you can do towards solidarity. And I define solidarity as a common definition is compassion or action on behalf of someone else who is unlike you in some way. So for us citizens, solidarity towards immigrants might be action on their behalf. So I do think that the first step in solidarity is seeking out the story and listening to the story. So you don't know what other people need you to do. You can't just act on their behalf without asking them. You might end up hurting them more than you help them. But if you seek them out and you listen to the story, and then you understand how the story interacts with your own story. So the parable of the Good Samaritan is often sort of interpreted to mean like, oh, we should be the Good Samaritan, we should help other people. And of course that's true. But scripture scholars often point out that if you look at the various people in the parable, Jesus's audience would have been most likely to identify with the Jew who is wounded. And then, a priest and a Levite come by and they do nothing. And then a Samaritan comes by. Who is the Samaritan? Well, it's someone, Samaritans formerly occupied the northern kingdom of Israel, which fell. And when it fell, there were a bunch of refugees rushing into the southern kingdom, to the kingdom of Judah. And these refugees had different practices than the people of Judah. They worshiped the same God, but the practices were very different. So Jews and Samaritans weren't exactly like blood enemies. They were like sibling rivals. Like they were alike enough that there was bad blood between them. And so the thought is, when Jesus's listeners heard this story about this Samaritan, they see themselves lying in the ditch, hoping for help from their fellows, the priest and the Levite. But instead, the Samaritan comes along and they think, oh, Samaritan. But who the Samaritan is the one who takes care of them. And there's a story in the Hebrew Bible about a group of wounded Israelite soldiers, wounded soldiers of Judah, who encounter a Samaritan, and the Samaritan takes care of them. So in a way, Jesus is reminding his listeners, like, oh, you don't like Samaritans. You think they're not going to do anything. But this is not the first time Samaritans have taken care of you. There's actually this history here, which is different than what you think it is. So I think the impetus to solidarity is listening to the story and then seeing how the story interacts with your own story. And then the third part is, can we tell a new story? So could Jesus's listeners walk away from hearing Jesus's parable and think, Samaritans are not who we thought they were. We have a history with Samaritans that is not all bad. And maybe when we look at a Samaritan, we shouldn't just see something that's bad. We should see our fellows. They're not strangers. They're not enemies. And so the concept of solidarity, I think, can be, again, it's prior to justice. Can we listen to a story that unsettles us in some way? Can we see how that story interacts with our own story? And then third, can we tell a new story about who immigrants are and why they're here? And then after solidarity, we can start working towards justice, more just asylum policies, for example, or like an end to the immigration detention system, where we imprison asylum seekers who've not committed any crime. But solidarity is working towards justice.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm excited to really see how people run with this. And I think it starts with us, right? It starts with the people around us and in the relationships, exactly like you were saying, the relationships that we have immediately before us. So thank you so much for sharing that. I do have a couple of closing questions for you guys. And I know that a lot of these will be complex and perhaps we can't expound on them as much as we'd want to, but we'll just kind of dive in. Question for any of you to answer: how should Christians think about undocumented immigrants?
I'll go. I think we were both waiting for each other, but since you spoke most recently, Dr. Rajendra, I'll let you catch your breath. I think the idea of can we tell a new story is actually very helpful here, because a lot of the stories we tell about undocumented immigrants are very simple, and a lot of times they aren't very accurate. So concerns about the criminal threat of undocumented immigrants, there's not really a lot of data to back that up. Now, certainly, I'm certain that there are people who have committed crimes who have entered the country illegally or whose papers have expired. But statistically, as an average, the group of undocumented immigrants aren't really a threat. They're also surprisingly not really that much of an economic drag on our country. At the local level, so local governments, maybe town, maybe county, there can be more of a financial burden there, but most data shows that undocumented immigrants put a lot more money into our federal and state level economies than they take out of it. So the IRS, for example, is one of the few branches of the government that's not particularly concerned to follow through on immigration law. They released some information a couple of years back that actually there's $12 million surplus each year from money paid into Social Security by undocumented immigrants in comparison with the money taken out. So one thing we can do is kind of, break down those simplistic stories that we sometimes hear of, they can be a threat, they can be a drag on the economy, and also break down the idea that they all come for the same reasons and in the same ways. Some cross a border, some have their papers expire, some come for a job, some come seeking asylum. And so that could be a starting point there.
Thank you, Dr. Butner. Anything to share, Dr. Rajendra?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Butner. That was a great overview of some false narratives about undocumented immigrants and a presentation of some true things about undocumented immigrants. I would say that, relationship first, who picks our vegetables? Like, yes, there are agricultural workers who are here on H-1A visas, but the federal government never has enough H-1A visas. And so there are people who come on a seasonal cycle to work as agricultural laborers. And, once the Trump administration started cracking down on undocumented workers, agricultural workers, the word got around and crops rotted in the field. So what is our relationship with undocumented immigrants? Well, a lot of them pick our food or slaughter our meat or build our houses in the construction industry. A lot of them have been invited here by companies who went to Mexico or Central America and recruited them. So I would say to think about undocumented immigrants truthfully, you not only have to have the facts that Dr. Butner shared, which are so important, but you also have to understand the relationship. I mean, they don't get benefits. So if they weren't working here, they wouldn't be here because they wouldn't be able to support themselves. What kinds of jobs are they doing? They're doing the jobs that we don't want to do. And that farmers and construction companies and textile factories in the US either cannot or do not want to pay US citizens to do that work.
Thank you for sharing that. So at the level of national policy then, are there areas where Christians should be seeking change? And if so, what are these areas?
Dr. Butner, yeah, I was thinking you should talk about asylum policy because it sounds like that's your area of research right now.
Sure. There are a lot of things there that I think we can change. Thanks for letting me go first, Dr. Rajendra. A lot of them we've heard about, family separation policy maybe, but I think one that I'm concerned about most that maybe you haven't heard about is something called Operation Streamline. So this is a policy that goes back several administrations. I think it was around 2005 that we first started this. But as we've increasingly criminalized border crossings, our courts weren't able to keep up. And so Operation Streamline combined sort of a zero tolerance policy, which is what it was called, but there were always exceptions. And what we've seen over the last 2 decades is just fewer and fewer exceptions, until most recently, even unaccompanied minors and families aren't exceptions anymore. But a zero tolerance policy, so more people are arrested, coupled with mass trials on the border. So in some places, up to 70 individuals can be tried at the same time with a single lawyer representing them, where they have maybe 5 minutes to speak to the lawyer before the trial. The whole trial may last half an hour. Many of those who've crossed the border maybe don't speak English, maybe don't understand the American legal system. And typically almost everybody that goes through Operation Streamline is convicted of a minor federal offense and then put in jail for 90 to 180 days and then sent back across the border. Besides the fact that this doesn't really allow for due process for people to really have the standards that our country has established for fair court hearings, I think it's also concerning because there are a number of people who've applied or who would intend to apply for asylum who don't ever get the chance because they're rushed through the system so quickly. So in terms of international law, the UN Declaration of Human Rights or the 1951 Refugee Protocol says it's actually not illegal for someone whose life is in danger to cross a border, even if they don't have the permission of that country to do so. But our sort of catch and rapid trial process of Operation Streamline means a lot of people never even get the chance to make the case that they need help. And then, by the way, because they've been convicted and put in prison for 30 days maybe, they now have a criminal record, and they don't really have any way of legally immigrating to the country as a result. That would be one area that maybe you haven't heard of that I'm concerned about, among many others that you probably have seen on the news, all the students watching this, that you might already be aware of.
Wow. Anything to add, Dr. Rajendra?
Yeah, I was going to mention something that goes maybe hand in hand with Operation Streamline that is also decades old, which is the immigration detention system, which is, when people come here, as Dr. Butner pointed out, legally, because it is not illegal to cross a border if you are fleeing for your life. If you are apprehended by border control, you are put, you're claiming asylum, while you wait for your trial, you are imprisoned. This was started by Reagan in the 80s, and it was expanded by every president since Reagan, Democrat and Republican. Today, our immigration detention system is the largest in the world. It's operated by for-profit prison companies. And this is prison. I mean, it's called detention. It is effectively prison. You're shackled. You're not allowed. You're allowed to go outside for maybe 30 minutes a day. People are often thrown in solitary. Families are detained. It's supposed to be for only 30 days and under for families, but 30 days for a child is a long time. And I think the Trump administration was fighting to keep children detained longer. So we imprison children for migrating to save their lives when they have done nothing illegal. And this is to the profit of these for-profit prison corporations. It's completely horrific. This should have been ended long ago. And yes, we should do everything we can to reunify the children separated from their parents. We should have sane asylum law, not only not detaining asylum seekers, but there's all this weirdness about asylum law that makes it very difficult to claim asylum if you're fleeing from a gang, which many Central Americans who are claiming asylum are afraid of their lives, not because their government is persecuting them, but because their government is overrun by transnational criminal enterprises that often had their roots in the United States. So we should also look at reforming asylum policy. But I think immigration detention, for me, is the one thing that it's an abomination, it's cruel, it's bipartisan, and it's decades old, and there's no reason to imprison asylum seekers. And, in some other countries, they also have it, but there are, other countries that do not imprison asylum seekers.
Thank you so much. That was so insightful. This is a lot, and this is so good, but I know this is so eye-opening. So as far as, for the people and individuals that will be watching this discussion, what are some action steps that they can take when acting in order to act responsibly towards immigrants? What would you recommend?
There are all sorts of immigration rights groups that you can join. I know if you speak Spanish or another language fluently, there are groups they're immigration lawyers who are looking for translators all the time. It feels overwhelming because there's so much that needs to be done. But joining up with an organization like Al Otro Lado or RICES, or those organizations that are working at the border, can be it's small things to do, but it can be a very powerful way to affect policy. And then the other thing is that, along with knowing the story and listening to the story, the other thing you can do is tell the story. If you have, to your neighbors, to your friends, to people at your churches, talking to people about immigration and trying to fight fear with facts. I don't know how much it works, but I believe that you can't just stay silent when you're hearing false narratives about immigrants.
That's so good. That is so good. Dr. Butner?
Yeah, I had a few practical tips, but another one actually came to mind with Dr. Rajendra's excellent explanation of the criminalization of border crossings and the whole detention system. Because it strikes me that for those of us who are Christian watching this discussion, and I know not all of our students are, but that often there can be sort of theological beliefs that lead Christians en masse to support these policies. And there are definitely exceptions, and there are some Christian groups that might be more prone than others. But I think of Romans 13, 1, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. And on the basis of a verse like that, a lot of people will say, well, they should be put in jail. They crossed the border illegally. They disobeyed that, and there are consequences. And as we've already mentioned, you know, if you look at international law, it's not quite that clear cut, excuse me. But even if we look at the Bible, we see all sorts of examples of stories of civil disobedience from, you know, Daniel or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the Old Testament, who didn't do what they were commanded, to the disciples in Acts, who were told not to spread the gospel and acted anyway, to someone like Esther, who wasn't supposed to go before the king without being summoned and did anyway in order to preserve life. So I think we need to learn to read the Bible in a more complex way so that we don't become complicit with some of the unethical things that might be happening in our region, at our nation, internationally, because we take, you know, one verse and don't think about how to balance the need to obey authorities with the also biblical truth that there are times where not obeying laws is acceptable. And I would think for many who are fleeing for their lives, that would be an acceptable reason to cross the border in a way that many Americans might view as illegally, but internationally might not even be illegal. So some of that theology might help us to avoid things like the mass incarceration of migrants.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think that's a great challenge for us in this roundtable. And I think definitely a lot of awesome points that we could be reflecting on and as Christians be practically putting into practice, being practical about it. So thank you so much, Dr. Rajendra, Dr. Butner, for sharing your thoughts, your research, and for just giving us insight on that. On that note, I'd love to close this out on a word of prayer, but before I do so, I'd love to read from the Beatitudes, from Matthew chapter 5, verse 2. And this is when Jesus is giving the Sermon on the Mount, if many of you are familiar, I'm sure, with that. It says, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And with that, I'd love to end us on a word of prayer. Father, we come before you today, and I just want to thank you. Thank you, Father, for equipping us. Thank you for the people that you've called to be the peacemakers. God, I ask that everyone watching this may desire that, may desire righteousness, may desire justice, may desire to do good before your eyes. God, I ask that you may not make us complacent, but stir our hearts for the suffering that our brothers and sisters go through. Thank you, Father, for your truth. Thank you for moments where we are convicted and moments that we know that we can enact change. I ask that you may be with us, grant us peace today, and wisdom as we walk about and grow in our relationships around us. We praise you, and in your name we pray. Amen. And last reminder, this is 2 credits for anyone watching. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. All right.